Richard Monroe had built his fortune from nothing, or so he told himself every morning when he looked at the gleaming towers bearing his name. At 72, he'd spent 50 years climbing, never looking back at what he'd left behind. But on that cold November evening, walking toward his Mercedes in the empty parking garage beneath his headquarters, he found someone sleeping in his back seat. The man was thin, maybe 60, wrapped in a threadbare coat that had seen better decades. Richard's hand went to his phone, ready to call security, when he noticed something that made him freeze. Tucked beside the sleeping man was a photograph, its edges worn soft from handling, showing two young boys on a porch swing. The way the light caught it, the way those boys smiled, something about it pulled at a memory Richard had spent half a century burying. He stood there in the dim garage, briefcase in hand, staring at a stranger who somehow felt familiar. "Where are you watching from tonight?" Richard didn't call security. Instead, he tapped gently on the window. The man stirred slowly, confusion crossing his weathered face as he realized where he was. He scrambled up, hands raised in apology, words tumbling out about how sorry he was, how he just needed somewhere warm, how he'd be gone in a second. But Richard surprised himself by opening the door and saying quietly, "It's cold out. How about we get some coffee first?" 20 minutes later, they sat in an all-night diner 3 blocks from Richard's building, a place he'd never noticed, despite passing it for years. The homeless man introduced himself as Daniel Webb, and his hands shook slightly as he wrapped them around the hot mug. Richard ordered him food without asking, eggs, toast, bacon, the works, and watched as Daniel ate with the careful dignity of someone trying not to appear desperate. They didn't talk much at first. Richard found himself studying the man's face, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter once, of better times. "I used to work construction," Daniel said finally, not meeting Richard's eyes. "Had my own small crew. Nothing fancy like your operation, but we did good work. Built homes people were proud of." His voice carried the rough edges of a lifetime lived outdoors, but underneath was something else. An education, maybe, a different life. "My boys worked with me summers. Teaching them the trade, you know? How to measure twice, cut once. How to take pride in what you build." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. "You have sons?" "Had." Daniel's voice went quiet. "Lost my wife first, Sarah. Cancer took her fast, 6 months from diagnosis to gone. The medical bills, they were crushing, but I'd have sold everything twice over for one more day with her." He stared into his coffee. "After she passed, I wasn't right in the head for a while. Started drinking to numb it. Lost the business. My boys, Michael and James, they tried to help, but I was drowning, and I pulled them down with me. Said things I can't take back, did things I'm not proud of." Richard listened, his untouched coffee growing cold. He'd built an empire on being decisive, on reading people quickly and moving on. But something kept him in that cracked vinyl booth, listening to a stranger's heartbreak. "Where are your sons now?" Daniel's jaw worked for a moment before he could speak. "Don't know. Haven't seen them in 15 years. They got tired of trying to save a man who didn't want saving. Last I heard, Michael moved out west somewhere. James, he stayed local, I think, but he doesn't want to be found. Not by me." He looked up then, and his eyes were clear despite the pain in them. "Can't blame them. I chose the bottle over my own boys. What kind of father does that?" The question hung in the air between them. Richard thought about his own son, Christopher, 37 now, and running the European division of Monroe Industries. When was the last time they'd had a real conversation? Not a quarterly review or a strategy meeting, but a real talk father to son. Christopher had married last year. Richard had attended the wedding, given a speech, written a generous check. But had he really been there? Had he ever been there? "Why my car?" Richard asked, needing to change the subject, to push away thoughts that came too close. Daniel managed a small smile. "Honestly, it looked warm and empty. The security guy usually does his rounds every 2 hours. I figured I could catch a few hours of real sleep somewhere that wasn't the shelter. Those places, they're safe enough, but you can't ever really rest. Too much noise, too much sadness, all pressed together." He paused. "I know what you're thinking. Why don't I get help? Get a job?" Truth is, at 63 with no address, no references, a criminal record for public intoxication, and hands that shake from years of hard living, nobody's hiring. "I've tried," Lord knows I've tried. Richard looked at this man who could have been him in another life, if different choices had been made, if luck had turned another way. He thought about the photograph he'd seen in the car, those two boys frozen in a moment of perfect happiness before everything fell apart. He thought about his own son, about all the little league games he'd missed, the school plays, the quiet dinners that could have been memories but were just empty spaces in time. He'd built towers of steel and glass, but what had he built that mattered? "Come with me tomorrow," Richard heard himself say. "To my office. I want to hear the rest of your story." Daniel's face showed surprise, then suspicion, then something like hope. "Why would you want that?" Richard stood, reaching for his wallet. "Because I think maybe you're supposed to teach me something." He put enough money on the table to cover the meal 3 times over. "Be at the Monroe Building, main entrance, 9 o'clock. Ask for me by name." As Richard drove home to his empty penthouse, he couldn't shake the image of that photograph. 2 boys on a swing, a father who lost everything, and somewhere in his chest, something he'd thought long dead began to stir, the memory of who he'd been before ambition had consumed everything else. Daniel showed up at 8:45, wearing the same clothes but clearly having made an effort to clean up. Richard met him in the lobby personally, ignoring the curious stares of his employees who'd never seen the CEO escort anyone without an expensive suit. He took Daniel to his private office on the 40th floor, where the city spread out below them like a kingdom of glass and ambition. "Tell me more about your boys," Richard said, settling into the chair across from Daniel rather than behind his imposing desk. "What were they like?" And Daniel did. For 2 hours he talked about Michael's love of drawing, how he'd sketch building plans on napkins at dinner, about James's terrible jokes and his gift for making anyone laugh even on the hardest days, about teaching them to fish in the creek behind their house, about birthday cakes and Christmas mornings and ordinary Tuesdays that became precious only in hindsight. Richard listened, and with every story, he felt the weight of his own failures growing heavier. "I have a son," Richard found himself confessing. "Christopher, sharp as they come, runs my European operations like he was born to it. But I don't know his favorite color. Don't know what he dreams about beyond the next quarterly report. I taught him about profit margins and hostile takeovers, but I never taught him to fish." Daniel looked at him with something like understanding. "It's not too late, you know. Your boy's still here, still alive. You've got time I don't have." But Richard wasn't sure that was true. Over the next few days, Daniel kept coming back. Richard had given him money that first night, enough for a motel room, new clothes, meals, but Daniel spent it carefully, making it last, never asking for more. Instead, he'd show up at the Monroe Building and they'd talk. Sometimes in Richard's office, sometimes walking through the city, sometimes over lunch at that same diner where it all began. Richard learned that Daniel had been sober for 3 years now, that he attended AA meetings in church basements and volunteered at a soup kitchen when he could, that he'd written letters to his sons, dozens of them, but never sent them because he didn't know where they were and wasn't sure he had the right to intrude on whatever peace they'd found without him. The letters were in a plastic bag Daniel kept with him always, along with that photograph. His whole history compressed into things he could carry. "Why do you keep trying?" Richard asked one afternoon as they sat in a small park, watching office workers hurry past on their lunch breaks. "If your sons are gone, if there's no way back, why stay sober?" "Why keep going?" Daniel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Because maybe it's not about getting them back. Maybe it's about becoming the man they deserve to have as a father, even if they never see it. Maybe it's about proving to myself that I was more than my worst mistakes." He turned to look at Richard. "What about you? Why do you keep building when you've got more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes? What are you trying to prove?" The question hit Richard like a physical blow. That night, alone in his penthouse, he looked at the photograph on his mantel, Christopher's college graduation, the two of them standing stiffly side by side, both in expensive suits, both wearing practiced smiles that never reached their eyes. When was the last time he'd hugged his son? Really hugged him? Not the brief corporate pat on the shoulder, but the kind of embrace that said, "I love you," in a language deeper than words. He picked up his phone and called Christopher in London. It was late there, past midnight, but his son answered on the second ring, voice alert and concerned. "Dad, is everything okay?" "When you were 8, Richard said, the words coming from somewhere he'd locked away. "You drew a picture of our house. Remember? You used every crayon in the box, even the broken ones. Your mother put it on the refrigerator and you were so proud." There was silence on the line. Then quietly, "I remember. You told me it was nice, but artists don't make good businessmen." I threw the crayons away the next day. Richard's heart broke. Actually broke, right there in his empty penthouse full of expensive things that meant nothing. "I was wrong," he said, his voice thick. "I was wrong about so many things, Christopher. About what matters, about what success really means. I'm sorry. If this moment touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up. Sometimes we need to hear these truths." Richard heard his son's breathing, unsteady now. "Dad, what's going on? Are you sick? Is something wrong?" "I met someone," Richard said. "A man who lost everything and taught me what I was throwing away. I need to tell you something, son. I need to tell you while I still can." And there, across thousands of miles of fiber optic cable, Richard Monroe began to build a bridge he should have built 30 years ago. He talked until dawn broke over London, and Christopher listened, sometimes crying, sometimes angry, sometimes just silent. But he listened, and that was something. The next morning, Richard went to his board of directors with an announcement that would shock the business world. He was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. More than that, he was liquidating his controlling shares in Monroe Industries. Christopher could have his portion, but the rest, hundreds of millions of dollars, would go into something new. Something that mattered. But first, he had to find 2 men named Michael and James Webb, and he had to give a father one more chance to say he was sorry. Finding Michael and James Webb proved harder than Richard had imagined. He hired private investigators, the best money could buy, but 15 years of silence had left few trails to follow. Daniel didn't know. Richard had kept the search quiet, not wanting to raise hopes that might be crushed. Instead, he focused on what he could do immediately. The announcement of his resignation sent shockwaves through the business community. CNBC ran segments analyzing what it meant for Monroe Industries. The Wall Street Journal speculated about his health, his sanity, his motives. Christopher flew home immediately, worried and confused, finding his father in that same diner where everything had changed, sitting across from a homeless man most people would have ignored. "This is Daniel," Richard said simply, and something in his voice made Christopher pause. The younger Monroe slid into the booth, and for the first time, Richard watched his son actually see someone other than himself. "Really see them," Daniel told his story again, and Christopher listened with tears in his eyes that he didn't try to hide. When Daniel finished, Christopher reached across the table and took the older man's weathered hand in his own. "My father's been trying to change," Christopher said quietly, "and maybe I have been too. Maybe we both needed to learn what really matters." He looked at Richard. "I'm sorry I've been so distant, Dad. I thought that's what you wanted, for me to be just like you. Cold, focused, successful at any cost. I wanted you to be better than me," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I just didn't know how to show you." That's when the investigators called with news. They'd found Michael Webb in Portland, Oregon. He owned a small architectural firm, was married with 2 teenage daughters, and hadn't spoken his father's name in 14 years. James Webb was closer, working as a high school counselor just 2 hours away in Philadelphia. He'd never married, lived alone, and according to neighbors, kept to himself. Both men had built lives from the rubble of their broken family. Neither wanted to be found. Have you ever held on to hurt for so long that it became part of who you are? Have you had to choose between protecting yourself and risking forgiveness? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes these stories help us understand our own hearts. Richard asked the investigators to reach out carefully, explaining only that there was a matter of importance regarding their father. Michael hung up twice. James agreed to meet, but his email made it clear he was coming only to get closure, to finally tell the old man exactly what his abandonment had cost. Richard shared this news with Daniel in the park, where they'd had so many conversations, and watched the hope drain from his friend's face. "Maybe this was a mistake," Daniel said. his hands trembling worse than Richard had ever seen them. Maybe some things are broken too badly to fix. I destroyed their childhoods. I chose booze over my own sons. What right do I have to walk back into their lives now and ask for anything, even forgiveness? The right of a man who changed, Richard said firmly. The right of a father who loves his sons enough to face their anger and pain. Daniel, you're sober. You're trying. You're the man they deserved all along. Even if they can't forgive you, even if they walk away forever, at least they'll know you tried. At least they'll know you're sorry. But doubt ate at Daniel through the sleepless nights before James agreed to meet. Richard found him one evening in the parking garage where this all began, sitting in that same Mercedes, staring at the photograph of his boys. The old man was crying silently, his shoulders shaking with grief held too long. What if I make it worse? Daniel whispered. What if seeing me just opens old wounds they'd finally healed? What if the kindest thing I can do is stay dead to them? Richard climbed into the backseat beside him, this billionaire in his expensive suit sitting with a homeless man in a car that cost more than most people's houses. You asked me once why I keep building. I think I was trying to build something big enough to fill the emptiness inside. But you can't build over emptiness. You have to face it, walk through it, heal it from the inside out. Your sons deserve to see the man you've become, and you deserve the chance to tell them you're sorry. Whatever happens after that, at least you'll know you tried. Daniel nodded slowly, clutching that worn photograph. James wants to meet next Tuesday. At a coffee shop in Philadelphia. He said he'll give me 1 hour, that's all. His voice was barely audible. 1 hour to explain 15 years. How do I even begin? You begin with the truth, Richard said, and you let love do the rest. Richard drove Daniel to Philadelphia that Tuesday, with Christopher in the back seat. They'd become an unlikely trio over these weeks. A billionaire learning humility, a homeless man finding redemption, and a son discovering his father was human after all. The coffee shop was small and warm, tucked between a bookstore and a pharmacy on a tree-lined street that felt far removed from the towers of Richard's corporate world. James Webb arrived exactly on time. He was 41, with his father's build but harder edges, eyes that had seen disappointment and learned to expect nothing else. He stopped in the doorway when he saw Daniel, and for a moment Richard thought he might turn and leave. But he didn't. He walked to the table and sat down, his posture rigid, his face carefully neutral. You look older, James said. And there was no warmth in it, just observation. I am older, Daniel replied softly. And I hope a little wiser. Thank you for coming. I know you didn't have to. James glanced at Richard and Christopher. Who are they? Friends, Daniel said. People who've been kind to me when they didn't have to be. But they can leave if you want privacy. Stay, James said sharply. I want witnesses to this. I want someone to hear what I have to say, because I'm only going to say it once. He turned to his father, and years of pain spilled out like water from a broken dam. You destroyed us. You know that, right? Mom died, and we tried to help you, tried to hold the family together, and you threw it away for whiskey. I was 26 years old, Dad. 26. I had to watch my father become a stranger. I had to bail you out of jail. Had to lie to Michael about where you were because he was younger, and I wanted to protect him from the worst of it. Daniel took it all, every word, never defending himself, never looking away. Tears ran down his face, but he didn't wipe them away. You're right, he said when James paused for breath. You're absolutely right. I failed you. I failed Michael. I failed your mother's memory. There's no excuse, no explanation that makes it okay. I'm sorry, son. I'm so deeply sorry. Sorry doesn't give me back those years, James said, his voice breaking. Sorry doesn't erase the nights I drove around looking for you in every bar, every alley. Sorry doesn't fix what you broke. No, Daniel agreed. It doesn't. Nothing can fix that. But I need you to know I'm sober now. 3 years and counting. I volunteer at shelters. I help other men who are where I was. I can't undo the past. But I'm trying to honor your mother's memory by becoming the man she thought I could be. The man you and Michael deserved as a father. James stared at his father for a long moment. Michael won't come, he said finally. I called him. Told him about your message. He said some doors should stay closed. He's built a good life in Portland. Wife, 2 daughters, a business he's proud of. He doesn't want you anywhere near it." The pain that crossed Daniel's face was almost unbearable to witness. Richard felt Christopher's hand grip his arm under the table, both of them silent observers to this fragile moment. "I understand," Daniel whispered. "Tell him I'm proud of him. Tell him I love him. Even if I never see him again, I need him to know that." James's careful neutrality cracked. "You don't get to love us anymore." "You gave up that right?" "Maybe," Daniel said. "But I do anyway. I love you both every single day. I pray for you, for your happiness, for your peace. That's all I have left to give you, and I'll keep giving it whether you want it or not." Something shifted in the coffee shop. James's hands, clenched so tightly on the table, slowly opened. "I have a nephew," he said quietly. "Michael's oldest is going to college next year. Wants to study architecture like her dad. And I've got 4 kids in my school who remind me of you every day. Lost, struggling, making bad choices. I help them because I couldn't help you. If you've been moved by this story, if it's touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this because they remind us what truly matters: family, forgiveness, and the courage to change." Daniel reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out that plastic bag, the one containing dozens of unsent letters. "I wrote to you," he said. "Both of you. Every week for 3 years. I didn't send them because I didn't have addresses and I wasn't sure I had the right. But I want you to have them now. You don't have to read them. You can throw them away." "But they're yours." James took the bag with shaking hands. The hour had stretched past 2, and neither of them had noticed. "I can't promise forgiveness," James said, his voice rough. "I can't promise we'll have a relationship. The damage runs too deep, I know," Daniel said. "But thank you for hearing me. Thank you for letting me say I'm sorry." James stood to leave, then paused. "I volunteer at my school's career day every spring. Maybe, if you're still sober next year, if you've proved this isn't just words, maybe you could come talk about construction, about making something beautiful from raw materials. The kids need to see that kind of skilled work matters. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a door, cracked open just an inch. And sometimes, that's where healing begins." The drive back to New York was quiet at first, each of them processing what they'd witnessed. Finally, Christopher spoke from the back seat. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. Both of them. The courage to face that pain, to sit in it without running away. That's what I've been doing my whole life," Richard said softly. "Running. Building empires is an excuse not to build relationships. Chasing success because it was easier than chasing connection." He glanced at Daniel, who was staring out the window at the passing landscape. "But I'm done running now." Over the next 6 months, Richard's transformation became complete. He sold his penthouse and bought a modest brownstone in Brooklyn, the kind of place with a stoop where neighbors actually talked to each other. He established the Sarah Webb Foundation for Family Restoration, named after Daniel's late wife, dedicated to helping families torn apart by addiction find their way back together. Daniel became the foundation's first counselor, his honesty about his own failures giving him credibility with others walking the same dark road. Christopher moved back from London, taking over Munro Industries not as his father's shadow, but as his own man, with his own vision. He and Richard had dinner together every Thursday, a standing appointment neither would break for any amount of money. They talked about real things now, about life, about fear, about what it meant to be a good man rather than just a successful one. Christopher taught his father to paint, and Richard discovered he wasn't half bad at it. His favorite subject was ordinary moments, a father and son fishing, children on a swing, people sharing coffee in a diner. James kept his word. That next spring, Daniel stood in front of 50 high school students at Career Day and talked about building things with your hands, about taking pride in craftsmanship, about how every building starts as just an idea and some raw materials. He talked about his sons, too, how he'd failed them, but how they'd built beautiful lives anyway, how proud he was of them. The kids listened with an intensity that surprised their teachers. Afterward, 3 of them asked if they could learn more about construction, about trades that used both hands and heart. James sat in the back of the auditorium through the whole presentation. When it was over, he approached his father carefully, like someone testing ice they weren't sure would hold. "You did good," he said. Mom would have been proud. It wasn't, "I'm proud," not yet. But it was closer than they'd been in 15 years, and Daniel accepted it like the gift it was. They began meeting every few months for coffee, brief conversations that stayed safe at first. Weather, work, neutral territory. But slowly, carefully, they began building something new. Not the relationship they'd had before, which was gone forever, but something different. Something earned through honesty and time. Michael never came. Daniel accepted this with a grace that Richard found humbling. "I lost that right," Daniel said one evening as they walked through Brooklyn. "I can't undo what I did. If the best thing I can give Michael is my absence, then that's what I'll give him. But James tells me his girls are doing well, and somehow that feels like a gift I don't deserve, but I'll take anyway." Richard told him then about the other part of his plan. He'd bought a small house in Philadelphia, near where James lived, and he wanted Daniel to have it. Not as charity, but as a place to build from. A place where, if James wanted, he could bring his family for dinner without worrying about where his father was sleeping. A place that said, "You matter, you're permanent, you're not just surviving anymore," Daniel cried. At 64, after years of living out of a plastic bag, he had a home again. "Why?" he asked Richard through his tears. "Why would you do all this for me?" "Because you saved my life," Richard said simply. "You showed me what I was losing before it was too late to save. My son talks to me now, really talks. We're building something real. How can I not help you do the same?" A year after that meeting in Philadelphia, James brought 4 kids from his school to volunteer at the Sarah Webb Foundation. Daniel taught them to fix things, broken furniture from donations, battered old buildings that became shelters. He showed them that fixing things outside yourself sometimes helped fix what was broken inside. One of those kids called him Mr. Webb with respect, came to him with problems, asked his advice. It wasn't the same as having his sons back, but it was purpose, and purpose was a kind of redemption. Richard Monroe died 5 years later at 77, not in a hospital, but in that Brooklyn brownstone, with Christopher holding one hand and Daniel holding the other. His last words were, "I built something good at the end, didn't I?" And Christopher, through tears, assured him he had. At the funeral, James gave the eulogy. He talked about a man who'd found a homeless stranger in his car and saw himself reflected there, who'd had the courage to change when change should have been impossible, who'd taught him that it's never too late to choose love over pride, connection over isolation. And standing in the back of that church, having flown in from Portland without telling anyone, was Michael Webb. He didn't stay for the reception, but he was there. And Daniel saw him, and that had to be enough. If you enjoyed this story, and it touched your heart, please remember to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Your support helps us keep bringing these moments of connection to people who need them. Daniel lives in that Philadelphia house still, volunteers at the foundation 4 days a week, and meets James for coffee every Sunday morning. They don't talk about the lost years much anymore. Instead, they talk about James's work, about the kids he's helping, about ordinary beautiful things that make up a life worth living. Michael sends a card at Christmas now, just a few lines. But it's signed "Your Son," and that matters more than Daniel can express. Sometimes the greatest success isn't what we build with steel and stone, but what we build with courage and love. Sometimes finding ourselves means losing everything we thought defined us. And sometimes a chance encounter in a parking garage can teach us that it's never truly too late to come home. Thank you for joining us on this journey. May you find the courage to build what truly matters in your own life.